Okay, so what I have just passed out to y'all is the sample annotated bibliography. So this should give you a model to work from when you are doing your annotated bit, right? This is more or less what it's supposed to look like. The one thing that I didn't do in this, because I did this for a slightly different purpose than you are, is I didn't include the credential information about the authors. But that is something that you all are going to need to do, right? So yeah, you are going to need to look up the credentials of the scholars that you cite. But yeah, give this, take a minute, look this over. Let me know if you have any questions about it or if this all looks like it makes sense.
How do we credit the credentials?
Just Google them. Yeah, just Google the person.
I'm saying like when we put it on there, is there a certain way we need to put it?
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Not how do you find them, how you actually. Okay, yeah. Just no particular way you have to put it. Just like Dermot Radigan is professor of media studies at University College Dublin or something like that, right? Just something that shows me that they have the necessary. Just a sentence that shows me they have the necessary expertise. That's all. Any other questions about what you're supposed to do with the annotated bibliography or how I need it set up?
So like, do we choose one of the collection papers or something and use it?
Yeah, and you'll use that as a kind of starting point, right? So if you've already picked out a particular theme or idea in one of the readings, in one of your reflection papers, then that should give you like your search keywords to the library databases to start with, right? So say, you wanted to do it on Audre Lorde, who we're reading next time, right? So your search terms when you're looking in the databases could be, something like, right, Audre Lorde and silence, or Audre Lorde and race, or something like depending on whatever you've chosen to focus on in the reading, right? And then that will help filter the articles in the database that you're only getting hits that are relevant. Does everybody understand, by the way, why you put the keywords in quotes and link them with a capitalized AND? Okay, this is actually something that'll get you better search results with any search engine that you use. Essentially what you're telling the computer, right, what you're telling the database to do is to only look for articles or sites that have these two words together and this word, or these two words together and this word, right? So that way you'll get results that are more relevant, right? It's usually better, we'll go over all this when we do our research day, but it's usually better to start with very specific keywords and very specific search terms, and then kind of broaden out if you're not getting any hits, right? Because the most specific search terms are going to get you your most relevant information. Okay. Any other questions about this?
When do we have to start on
I start early because your Thanksgiving break, it goes by fast.
What's that?
I was going to say I'd start early because Thanksgiving break goes by pretty fast.
Yeah, I mean, we're gonna do our research day when we come back from Thanksgiving break, but it probably wouldn't hurt if you did a little bit on your own before that. So let me show you where to look for stuff on the library websites, right? And that way you can kind of get a head start on it. Okay, so if you go to the GSW homepage, go to the academics tab at the top of the page, scroll down to library, and you're going to want the Galileo tab, right? Now, you could just type whatever search terms you want into Galileo, but that's actually pretty inefficient because it's going to search every database the library subscribes to, right? So you're going to get a lot of things that are irrelevant. So what you want to do instead is narrow your search by subject. So most of the things that we are looking at, you'll find something on it if we go to literature and writing. And the most useful database for this is the MLA International Bibliography. So we click on this, and let's just see what we do by doing a basic search on Audre Lorde and silence. Okay, so this gives us 9 hits. Now we'll have to kind of look through these titles and the keywords here to see which ones are actually potentially relevant, right? So like, for example, these two look like they're probably relevant to the Lorde essay that we're reading. This one, probably not. So what you do is you look through your list here, you pick something that looks like, okay, this looks like it's potentially something that I want, right? Sometimes you'll get a link to a full text PDF directly from the bibliography. That's great. You can just download that right away to your desktop and keep it and not have to worry about finding it anymore. But in most cases, that's not going to happen. So what you're going to need to do is go back to the library page and click on this service, which is called Tipasa. So Tipasa is an interlibrary loan service, right? And what they will do is send you PDFs of articles that you request, right? So yeah, so for example, so I've got a bunch of PDFs here from things that I've requested for my own research or course prep or things like that. You get 5 views, but generally what I do is when I click it the first time, I just download it and keep it.
Like you get 5 a semester, or just like 5?
No, 5 for each article.
Oh.
Yeah, you get 5 free views for each article. So if you say you click it and forget to download it the first time or whatever, right, then you've got 4 more chances. But what you'd want to do if you want this article, right? You click on Create Request, and it's gonna need some information from you, right? It's gonna need the journal title. Okay, so the journal title there is the Quarterly Journal of Speech. The date is February 1997. And they always want to know where you learned about the item. I personally think that this question is irrelevant and pointless, so I usually just give them an answer that makes them think I'm crazy. Like, demonic whispers on the night winds. I want to figure that out. Okay, volume number is going to be this right here, so that's 83. Issue number is always going to be next to the volume number in parentheses, so that's 1. Page numbers, 49 to 70. And the title of article, you can usually just copy and paste.
Did it say the amount of page numbers on there?
Yeah, the page numbers are here right after the volume and issue number. And the author is one Lester C. Olson. Service if you want a copy, so they'll send you a PDF rather than a physical journal. And then you have to give them the date by which you need it. But usually when you make a request through this service, the turnaround is usually pretty quick, as long as you're not asking for something really obscure. So like you will probably have your PDF within 48 hours of making the request. So I don't know, get it to me by the end of next week. And then yeah, you will have to give them your ID number, your 913 number, and then you just, if I actually wanted this, I would click Submit Request, and the request would go off to all the libraries that subscribe to the system. And then in a couple of days, it would have my article. So we'll go over all this stuff in more detail, and I'll show you some more resources when we come back from the break. But this should give you enough to give you a head start with the research, right? So does anybody have any questions? Now that I've gone and closed everything out.
And we just need 5 of those.
Yeah, you will need 5 secondary sources. And remember too, like once you've got 1 or 2, you can use those to find others, right?
And like, when we're actually writing that part,
Uh-huh.
what are we putting in that?
Okay, so what you're giving me, and this is all laid out in the assignment sheet for the paper, but essentially what you're giving me is just a rundown of what the author's argument is and how you're going to use that in your paper.
That's what the description is, or is that what the?
Yeah,
So
like,
should I-
I'm asking like, what?
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay, well, wouldn't that be repetitive if we like have one main argument? And then, like, I don't know, I'm just confused.
I guess I'm not
These
really
these
sure
are
what
your
you're
5
asking.
sources that you're gonna use to support
Yeah.
your
So throughout the descriptions, we tell how the source supports.
yes.
Yeah. In brief, like, right? So just like give me a brief summary of what the source is doing to support their argument. And then how you're going to use that source to support your argument, right? Do you agree with this source? Do you disagree with this source? Does it support
So
what
we
you're trying to
actually
say?
say if we agree or disagree.
Yeah. All right, any other questions? And just remember again, like the reason I want you to do the annotated bibliography first is because I want you to do the research portion first, so that one, you're not scrambling to do it at the end, right? Because this is the part of the paper that takes the longest. So the earlier you start it, the better off you're going to be. You can't you can't write a research paper overnight. So this way you've at least got a couple weeks head start, right? And I also want to make sure that you've actually looked at what other people have said and considered what other people have said about your chosen text before you sit down and try to write about it yourselves. Okay, any other questions?
This is just really quick, just a formatting question.
Yeah, sure.
So, like the headers and everything, whenever I went to the writing center, they told me like a slightly different way to do it. Is your way right or is their way right?
I honestly
Or
don't.
do you-
I honestly
matter?
don't care.
Okay, cool.
I would say do it their way because other instructors might care.
Okay.
But yeah, I don't really give a shit. What
Okay, I was just making sure.
I guess some people are details people and some people are big picture people, and I'm really more of a big picture, big idea person. The fiddly little details I just don't care about. Which might make me a bad teacher, I don't know. But.
No.
Is there like certain amount of word count that we need to meet for each of the?
Just like give me about 5 sentences for each. So there's no specific word count, but yeah, you're basically gonna give me a decent sized paragraph for each. You know, essentially what you're giving me is proof that you read the source and you thought about it. Anything else? Okay then. Well, as you know, I am I apologize, by the way, to anybody who emailed me this weekend and didn't get a response right away. Circumstances. But you know that generally I'm usually pretty quick to answer email. I will also be, I'll be around throughout the whole Thanksgiving break. So if people have questions, right, just shoot me an email. My family is coming down from Pennsylvania in the middle of the week, but they'll only be there from late Tuesday night to Friday morning. So I will be available to answer questions. Okay. So I know that Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail is a frequent 1101 example. That this is something that a lot of you have probably been over before in some way, shape, or form, right? So why don't we start with your prior experience with this and what you already know about it in its context. What do y'all know about King's letter already?
It's written to the 8 clergymen about the criticism that they said how it was untimely and unwise.
Yeah, it's written in response to a very specific rhetorical situation, right? So, these 8 other Alabama clergymen whose letter I've got up here on the screen now, had written to the newspapers, arguing against a particular action that King was involved in. Do y'all know what that particular action was?
Was it a protest? Like they were invited, like this group of Southern Christian leadership?
Yeah, it is. It was a protest. It was a very specific protest and one that was kind of disruptive.
It was about desegregation.
Yep. Specifically, it was a bus boycott. And bus boycotts were one of the most common strategies adopted by civil rights groups in the late 50s and early 60s, right? So to move this back a little bit, right, to give you some context for the bus boycotts, which give you some context for King, right? Is anybody at all familiar with a 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board of Education?
We briefly spoke about it.
Okay. Do y'all know what this decision, or what this decision struck down?
It wasn't like segregation between schools.
Yeah, it was specifically about school segregation, right? So segregated schools were based on Supreme Court, like the idea that there could be segregated schools, right, was based on a Supreme Court decision from sometime in the 1890s, I don't remember the exact date, called Plessy v. Ferguson. And what Plessy v. Ferguson had done was established in law the notion of separate but equal public accommodations, right? That is, that you could refuse to offer a certain accommodation to one group of people, provided that a separate accommodation of equal quality or value was available to them, right? So this principle was used in particular to segregate schools, right? Now, by 1954, it was clearly demonstrable that separate did not mean equal, and that black schools were underfunded, consistently under-resourced, much in the same way many black neighborhoods were underfunded, under-resourced, and in the 50s also being bulldozed and cut apart by highways. So what Brown v. Board did was strike down separate but equal. So it wasn't just about school segregation, right? That was specifically what the case addressed. But what it really struck down was this notion that you could offer supposedly separate but equal accommodations to different groups of people, right? So this really kind of paved the way for desegregating various public services, including public transit systems, and that's what these bus boycotts were about, right? So the first big bus boycott was in Montgomery, Alabama. Are any of you familiar with Rosa Parks?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, Rosa Parks was one of the big movers behind this particular boycott. What do y'all know about Rosa Parks?
She sat on the bus.
What's that?
She sat on the bus.
Yeah.
She wouldn't get up.
She was told to move by a white
Yeah, and
person.
she wouldn't
Yeah,
move.
she wouldn't
She
give up
said
her,
no.
yeah, she wouldn't give up her seat to a white man.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, this is often kind of depicted in popular culture and media as a spontaneous decision by a sweet old lady, right? Rosa Parks was actually a longtime civil rights activist, and this was a planned action, right? She absolutely 100% knew what she was doing and did it intentionally. And this sparked bus boycotts across the city, right? So the transit system was disrupted by this action, right? And so this then spread to other cities, like, okay, this is a good model for doing something that is peaceful, right? It's nonviolent, but is still disruptive enough to get attention. Because, you know, when you are planning a protest of any sort, right? Do you want your protest to be quiet and meek and out of the way? Yeah, what happens if that's what your protest looks like?
No one
She's
sees
gonna
me.
get up.
Yeah, people are just gonna ignore it, right? They're just gonna drive right by and not even notice you. So yeah, an effective protest usually has to, you know, make the gears stop moving in some way, right? Has to get in people's way. So King, in 1963, is invited to Birmingham, Alabama, to help coordinate a series of bus boycotts there. Right? So they're following the same strategy that had been successful in desegregating the Montgomery bus system, Montgomery public transit. And what we have up here on the screen is the letter written and signed by a group of local Birmingham clergymen from a variety of different Judeo-Christian traditions arguing against King's actions, right? So let's look at this first. And I want to try to think about what assumptions are underlying the arguments that these clergymen are making. Like, what assumptions about who gets to make decisions, what assumptions about politics, right? What kinds of assumptions about even time are being made in this, right? So can I get somebody to start reading from the first paragraph here, from We the Undersigned Clergymen?
We, the undersigned clergymen, are among those who in January issued an appeal for law and order and common sense in dealing with racial problems in Alabama. We express understanding that honest convictions in racial matters could properly be pursued in the courts, but urge that decisions of those courts should be in the meantime be peacefully obeyed. would expect.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. So let's pick apart some of the key words, because I think even in this first paragraph, they're tipping their hand a bit as to what their values are, right? So what did they call the statement they issued in January? What are the things they were calling for there?
Law and order and common sense.
Yeah, law, order, common sense. So what does this suggest about their thinking here? That they're calling for law and order and common sense. What's their objection then to the bus boycotts based on?
I don't understand what you're asking.
Okay, it might become a little bit more clear if we kind of pair this with some of the other things they're saying, right? What do they have to say about the courts a little bit later on?
I talk about them like bringing in like higher power, like they bring in like getting the court involved to the judge.
Uh-huh. Well, where do they think the proper decision-making capacity lies about, say, things like people's rights?
Within the courts.
Yeah. So they're talking law and order and common sense, right? And they're saying follow the court rulings, right? Now let's continue on here with the next paragraph. Since that time, if somebody could read that for us, please.
Since that time, there have been some evidence of increased forbearance and a willingness to face facts. Responsible citizens have undertaken the work of various problems which cause racial friction and unrest. In Birmingham, recent public events have given indication that we all have opportunity for a new constructive and realistic approach to racial problems.
Okay, let's try to pick a couple of words out of this here that might be related to things that we saw in the first paragraph, right? So we got law, order, common sense, and the courts, right? Can we see things in this paragraph that might be kind of strung along a similar theme?
Where it says to face facts.
Okay, face facts. Good.
What does forbearance mean?
Forbearance means patience. Like a kind of willingness to wait.
Racial problems, and the first one is like racial friction. Is that like the same thing?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Public events.
What's that?
I was gonna say public events.
Okay. Recent public events.
Constructive and realistic.
Yeah, constructive and realistic, right? I think, yeah, face facts and realistic go together pretty well here, right? So what are they then suggesting about the people who want to be involved in King's action?
It's not like the right thing, the right way to go about it, that you should do it this way.
Uh-huh. And why is it, you know, if responsible citizens are willing to face facts and be realistic, then what is being suggested about the citizens following King's path?
That they're not responsible.
Yeah, that they're not responsible or realistic, right? They're suggesting that the citizens participating in things like the bus boycotts are deluded in some way, right? Now, I think we get a lot of mileage here from the next two paragraphs. Can I get someone to read these for us? We started with however we are now confronted.
However, we are now confronted by a series of demonstrations. Do I have to say the N-word?
You don't have to, no.
By some of our citizens directed and led in by outsiders. We recognize the natural impatience of people who feel that their hopes are slow in being realized. But we are convinced that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely. With agree rather with certain local leadership, we have called for honest and open negotiation of racial issues in our area. We believe this kind of facing of issues can be best accomplished by citizens of our own metropolitan area white and meaning with their knowledge and experience of the local situation. All of us need to face that responsibility and find proper channels for its accomplishment.
Okay, thank you. So first thing to know, just everybody does understand, right, that in 1963, right, this word would not have been considered a slur, right? It's acquired that now, but this was just the way people talked about race in 1960. Like, I hate doing that whole, well, that's just what times were like, because it doesn't make it right. But there was no intentional racial slur involved in this group's use of that word, right? In fact, King himself uses it. But what's going on then in these two paragraphs?
I mean, it's kind of saying the same thing, but
Uh-huh.
saying that, you know, what King's doing and whoever agrees with them is, like, not just, you know, not right, but it's just not timely and it's unwise.
Okay, yeah, untimely, unwise, right? So we can kind of pair that with the forbearance in the previous paragraph, right? And which people are showing forbearance and which people are being untimely and unwise? What else is revealed here about the way they're thinking about King and his people?
That is just the
That
part.
they're unwise and untimely, like that's just not the time for
They're unwise and untimely, right? Or the people following them are, right? However, we are now confronted by a series of demonstrations by some of our citizens directed and led in part by outsiders.
So they call
includes,
them
he
outside.
includes people that aren't within the group that wasn't invited.
Yeah, so because King's from Atlanta, right? He's not from Birmingham, he's not local. So what they're doing is painting him as an outside agitator, right? Right. Local people are willing to be patient. It's these folks from Atlanta coming in here who are making trouble and getting people riled up. So he's associating forbearance and patience and responsible behavior with the local community, right? And untimely and unwise behavior with these outsiders.
But didn't they, like, ask King to come?
Oh yeah, and
all that?
that's
So it's
one of the
not-
first things that King mentions
Yeah,
in his
so it's
letter, right?
not-
Is that my organization has offices here, and they asked us to come.
Yeah, so it's not just like the outsiders or whatever.
Yeah.
They
It's
really
them
didn't give
too.
him time to like do what he needed to do. They were just like, oh no, that's a time. So
Mhm.
we're just gonna.
Yeah. Well, I think that again, like, if we look at this next paragraph here, this is telling us also where they think decision making should be centered, right? So we've already noted, right, they talk about following court orders, right? Do what the courts say.
They also state in the next paragraph that it should be like decided by their own.
It should be decided by local citizens, and in particular, local leadership, right? So do these clergymen seem to believe in a bottom-up model of decision-making where citizens decide what's best for them, or in a top-down model where leaders and elites make decisions for everybody?
Top down.
Yeah, this is very much like a top-down model, right? Trust leaders, trust institutions, right? Right? Trust the courts, trust local leadership. And I think it's actually probably worth going now to King's letter and looking at how he responds specifically to this let local leaders handle it idea, right? If we look on page 352, can I get somebody to start reading from Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States.
Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. Its ugly record of police brutality is known in every section of this country. Its unjust treatment of Negroes in the courts is a notorious reality. There have been more unsolved bombings of Negro homes and churches in Birmingham than any city in this nation. These are the hard, brutal, and unbelievable facts. On the basis of these conditions, Negro leaders sought to negotiate with the city fathers, but the political leaders consistently refused to engage in good faith negotiation.
Okay, so what is he saying about the path that they're suggesting is followed, right? Where leaders of the black and white communities negotiate with each other.
It shows injustice and truth.
Let's look at those last two sentences there. What's he specifically telling his audience here about this approach?
That the political leaders consistently refuse to engage in good faith negotiation.
Yeah, it's like, we tried it, right? This was already tried, and it didn't work. Now, he's also describing, things like police brutality here, right? Because what does this have to do with the law and order arguments of these other 8 clergymen, right? What is he suggesting about law and order in Birmingham? Oh, you got the shaky desk.
Yeah.
Why is he mentioning, violence by police against citizens, all these unsolved crimes against black citizens?
I think he's trying to prove that the leaders, which would be like higher power, is wrong just due to the police
They can't be
brutality.
negotiated with.
And that,
Yeah.
yeah.
They're not willing to negotiate, right? And so what's happened to black citizens of Birmingham who've tried to trust in institutions, who've tried to trust the courts or trust the police, or trust local civic leaders?
I mean, they're let down by it because they don't.
Yeah. Yeah, he said these institutions that you're telling us to trust, right? These institutions you're telling us to follow have already failed to solve the problem. And in fact, in some cases, are actively part of it. So asking people to sit back and wait patiently for these institutions to do their work, right? It's just not going to happen. Right? That's not going to move anything forward. So we kind of continue with this in the next paragraph. And get somebody to read from "Then came the opportunity last September."
Then came the opportunity last September to talk with some of the leaders of the economic community. In these negotiating sessions, certain promises were made by the merchants, such as the promise to remove the humiliating racial signs from the stores. On the basis of these promises,
Reverend Shuttlesworth.
Reverend Shuttlesworth and the leaders of the Alabama Christian Movement of Human Rights agreed to call the moratorium.
Moratorium. Do y'all know what a moratorium is?
Nope.
Okay, so a moratorium is a temporary suspension. So like when, like if a state issues like a moratorium on death penalty cases, right? It means they're suspending the death penalty for the time being, right? So, all right, carry on.
Moratorium on any type of demonstrations. As the weeks and months unfolded, we realized that we were the victims of a broken promise. The signs remained. Like so many experiences of the past, we were confronted with blasted hopes and the dark shadows of the deep disappointment so upon us. So we had no alternative except that of preparing for direct action, whereby we would present our very bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the local and national community. We were not unmindful of the difficulties involved. We were decided to go through a process of self-purification. We started having workshops on nonviolence and repeatedly asked ourselves the questions: are you able to accept blows without retaliating? Are you able to endure the ordeals of jail? We decided to set up our direct action program around the Easter season, realizing that with the exception of Christmas, this was the largest shopping period of the year. Knowing that a strong economic withdrawal program would be the byproduct of a direct action, we felt that this was the best time to bring pressure on the merchants for the needed change. Then it occurred to us that the March election was ahead, and so we speedily decided to postpone action until after Election Day. When we discovered that Mr. Connor was in the runoff, we decided again to postpone action so that demonstrations could not be used to cloud the issues. At this time, we agreed to begin our nonviolent witness the day after the runoff.
Okay, so what is he trying to demonstrate here about the planning of these demonstrations? Were these spontaneous, ill thought out?
No.
Why not?
I mean, they thought about it a lot. Like, they thought about, like, the exact time that they should do it, or
Yeah.
like, when it would be, like, wrong, or when people wouldn't notice. So they thought about the exact time, and they knew the consequences, and they were willing to go through it and everything.
And they even delayed it, right?
Yeah.
So as not to interfere with the runoff election. So, yeah, so what he's saying is, like, we were patient, right? We put this off from when we originally planned to do it, and we made sure we were ready before we did it. So he's trying to answer the criticism that this was unwise and untimely, right? That he and his organization simply lack patience. I think there are two passages I want to look at that are related to this. One of them is kind of near the end, page 361. Right. It's the second full paragraph on the page. Right, he says, I had the strange feeling when I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery several years ago that we would have the support of the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be some of our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of the stained glass windows. So I want to focus here for a second on the stained glass window as a kind of metaphor. What's a stained glass window? How is a stained glass window different from a regular window, like, say, that one?
Isn't that the one with the paintings and stuff?
You can't see out of it or anything.
Yeah, it's colored, right? It's painted or dyed, really, and yeah, you can't see through it, right? It's opaque. Right, so it's pretty, and there may be, like a little kind of like biblical story, or an image of a saint or something, right, portrayed on the stained glass window. But it stops you from seeing outside, and it stops other people from looking in, right? So how is this a particularly effective metaphor for what he regards as the insufficient allyship of white churches and white synagogues?
They're like biased, I guess, like they can't see to any other picture other than
They don't like the point of view that they're not treated how the black people are treated.
They're not, right? Yeah. And they don't have to know, right? What the experience, what that experience is. And I think like we can also probably trace some of this back to Jeremy Bentham, because I think that there are similar ideas here at work in the clergyman's letter. And King is actually doing something that's not completely unlike what Ursula Le Guin was doing in The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. So Bentham was all about talking about pleasure or pain as essentially as abstractions, right? He doesn't really talk about specific forms of pleasure or pain, or how they affect particular groups of people, or even how pleasure and pain might be subjective in any way, right? Just that what a government should do is strive to increase the people's pleasure and reduce their pain, right? So it encourages thinking about the population as a whole as a kind of abstraction, right? Not as specific individuals with particular desires or problems. And Le Guin gets around that by giving us the image of the child, right? It's like, okay, what if the price of your pleasure is the intense, constant, unending suffering of one single child, right? And I'm going to paint this for you in gruesome detail so you know exactly what the bargain is. And then it's harder, even if you ultimately agree, to say this is worth it, right? Now, is there a place where King is doing something similar, where he's presenting specific, concrete examples of experience to these white clergymen who are talking about his rights as an abstraction?
Is it where he traveled, where it says that he traveled in Alabama, Mississippi, and all the other states?
Can you point us there?
It's at the end of 361.
Oh, end of 361, okay.
I think there's another.
Let's turn for a minute to page 354. That long paragraph that starts at the bottom of the page, right? Can I get somebody to read from starting with, we must come to see with the distinguished jurist of yesterday.
We must come to see with the distinguished jurist of yesterday that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed towards the goal of political independence, and we still creep at horse and buggy pace towards the gaining of a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. I guess it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, brutalize, and even kick your black brothers and sisters with impunity, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in a airtight cage of poverty in the midst of a national society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see the depressing clouds of inferiority begin to form in her little mental sky, and see her begin to distort her little personality by unconsciously developing a bitterness towards white people. When you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son asking in agonizing pathos, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? When you take to take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you. When you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored.
Okay, we can pause there because I think we kind of get the idea here, right? So what is he trying to do, or what is he trying to illustrate for the people who wrote that letter?
That they don't go through what the colored people go through.
Yeah, that their experience, right, is completely cut off from what his personal experience is, right? And the personal experience of all Black Americans, right? So he's making this abstract idea concrete for them, right? It's like they're aware of racial injustice as a kind of legal abstraction, right? It's like what he's trying to show them is like, okay, this is what it actually looks like and feels like. Right, so he's trying to excite a sympathetic emotion here. So again, goes back to the Adam Smith stuff, right? That what we need to be able to do in order to behave morally, right, is to imagine another person's situation. And so he's giving them the necessary tools for them to imagine what his situation is, right? And the situation of people like him.
Adam Smith is one way. It was like sympathy, right?
Yeah.
For someone's just like,
Yeah, that, we can never directly feel what another person feels. The best we can do is imagine it, right? Based on our own sense experiences. But that because we can put ourselves in another's shoes, we behave morally and ethically, right? So see why I had you read all that stuff before I had you read this? It does all kind of, it all kind of adds up. So there's another thing on it, like the stained glass window metaphor, I think, is also particularly effective in considering who the specific audience for the letter is, right? There's a broader audience he's trying to reach, like a general public audience. But remember that it's a specific response to a group of clergymen. Right, so there's a suggestion there, kind of almost a hint, that these guys are hiding in their churches instead of actually getting out there and helping. So another theme running through this that I kind of want to look at is the types of allusions and examples that King uses in his argument, right? And why they're particularly appropriate for this audience. So if we go to the beginning, if we turn to page 351, right, so he spends the first two paragraphs addressing the outsider controversy, right, whether or not he is an outsider. But can I get somebody to read for us the paragraph that starts with, "Beyond this, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here."
beyond this, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the 8th century prophets left their little villages, and carried their thus saith the Lord, far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns. And just as the Apostle Paul left his little village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to practically every hamlet and city of the
Greco-Roman
world, I too am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my particular hometown like Paul. I must consistently respond to the
Macedonian
call for aid.
Isn't a hamlet just like a small town or village or something like that?
Yeah, a hamlet is a little village, yeah. So let's look at the two examples he cites here, right? Who is he citing as examples for his behavior in this
Paul.
paragraph? Okay, on the one hand, the Apostle Paul. Yep, okay. And who else?
The 8th century prophet.
And the 8th century prophets, yes. Whom we get a list of in the footnotes. So why these two examples?
Because I feel like he like says, I am too compelled to carry the gospel, and both of them carry the gospel. So I feel like he can relate. He relates to them too.
Paul was like, Paul wrote letters and stuff to all those towns and everything, and he was asked by those people like for help and a lot of times and everything. So I feel like he's a lot like Paul.
Yeah, so okay, so he's looking at both of these, or this figure in this group, right, as, quote unquote outsiders, right, who came into other places and stirred things up.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's another way in which these examples are meant to be effective and also inclusive when looking at who his specific audience is here, right? Were all of the clergymen who signed that letter Christian clergymen? There was one rabbi as well, right?
So no.
Yeah, so the 8th century prophets would relate more specifically to Jewish tradition, right? Well, their texts forming, like most of the corpus of the Hebrew Bible. And the Apostle Paul relates specifically to the spread of Christianity from a small Jewish splinter sect in the Middle East to eventually the state religion of the Roman Empire, right? I've heard it, read. I read somewhere a statement by some scholar. They said that there probably could have been a Christianity without Christ, but not without Paul. So he's nodding here to both of those religious traditions, right? And we see him doing similar things in other passages. If we look, for example, on page 355, right? You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern. Since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in the public schools, it is rather strange and paradoxical to find us consciously breaking laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer is found in the fact that there are two types of laws. There are just and there are unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine when a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. To use the words of Martin Buber, the great Jewish philosopher, segregation substitutes an I-it relationship for the I-thou relationship and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. So segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, but it is morally wrong and sinful. Paul Tillich has said that sin is separation. isn't segregation an essential expression of man's tragic separation, an expression of his awful estrangement, his terrible sinfulness? So I can urge men to disobey segregation ordinances because they are morally wrong. So before getting into the real content of these paragraphs about law and about separation, I want to look at the identity of each of these authorities that he cites here, right? So St. Augustine is one of the early church fathers. So an authority that people in any Christian tradition would recognize. Also, incidentally, and perhaps cleverly here, St. Augustine was also African. He belonged to a North African ethnic group called the Berbers. St. Thomas Aquinas is a medieval Catholic saint. Martin Buber, we know, is Jewish. And Paul Tillich was a 20th century Protestant theologian. So the signers of that letter, right, included, a rabbi, a couple of Catholic bishops, and several Protestant clergymen, right? So what has he done by using these particular examples in this paragraph?
He's saying that in all of these religions, the people who signed it is still wrong.
Yeah, exactly. He's pointing to something in traditions that all of these men share. That they're all saying a similar kind of thing about the justice or injustice of particulars. Basically when it's okay to break the law, right? When it's morally right to break the law, right? So there's also a separation here between, right, morality and law, right? That law and order aren't necessarily in and of themselves good, right? They're only good if the laws themselves are in accordance with our moral sense, right? And I think the way he's using Paul Tillich here at the end is particularly interesting, right? So Tillich's theory basically is that sin is separation, right? So he doesn't finish the sentence. The full thing that Tillich says is that sin is separation from God, right? That when one sins, it brings you further, it takes you further away from God, right? But how is King using this idea of sin is separation here, right? When he says, isn't segregation an existential expression of man's tragic separation, an expression of his awful estrangement, his terrible sinfulness?
By segregating what they're doing, they're sinning, basically?
Okay, yeah, that segregation is sin. And I think that it's in the nature of what segregation is, right? Literally speaking, what is segregation? What does the word itself mean?
Separating.
Yeah, exactly. You're separating people from each other, right? On the basis of some arbitrary characteristic like race. So he's arguing that the very nature of segregation laws, right, that separate people, that split communities into, us and them, right? That this is in and of itself at least symbolically sinful, right? Now, there's another example that he cites here that I want to talk a little bit about. Maybe it's not where I thought it was. It's a comparatively lengthy piece compared to what we usually do. There is another context for this as well that we didn't talk about. So when he discusses the nations of Asia and Africa on page 354, we already read this passage, moving with jet-like speed toward the goal of political independence, and we still creep at horse and buggy pace toward the gaining of a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. Does anybody know what he's referring to when he talks about the nations of Asia and Africa gaining independence at jet-like pace? What was happening in the 50s and 60s? You okay?
Yeah.
Okay. What was happening in the 50s and 60s that would lead him to say this?
Didn't we just read something about this? About segregation happening in...
Yeah, we actually, that is actually kind of relevant to what was happening in the Desmond Tutu piece. Although Tutu was writing in the 90s, right, as...
yeah, that's why I was confused, because
yeah.
it was like, all of this is happening at jet-like speed in other places, and I was like, then why was that after
Yeah,
this?
well, South Africa had a large enough and rich enough white minority that they were able to entrench themselves in power for a good bit of time. What he's referring to is decolonization in the mid-20th century. What's that?
So I would have never gotten that.
Well, it's, you know, I give you the chance, and you know, then I explain. So after World War II, all of these European-centered empires, the British Empire, the French Empire, you know, like all of these European nations that had conquered all of this territory in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Asia, those nations that they conquered began declaring their own independence and breaking away. So, for example, in 1947, right, British India was split up into 4 different countries, right? Pakistan, Burma, India, and Sri Lanka. And then Pakistan itself further splits into Pakistan and Bangladesh. But you had similar processes going on in Africa, in the Caribbean. You know, you had Jamaica, Antigua, other nations in the Caribbean declaring independence, Trinidad and Tobago. And so while all of these countries are breaking away and forming their own new independent identity, King is arguing that in the United States, progress for non-white people, right, which, you know, they're people who are getting self-determination elsewhere in the world, like in the U.S., you know, people are fighting just to be able to eat at a lunch counter, right? Just to go into a restaurant or a store and get service. So, you know, he's, you know, drawing an analogy here, but between these decolonization struggles and what's going on in the U.S. to show these clergymen again that no, things are actually happening really, really slowly here. Right. So your counseling patience is misplaced. All right. So we are about out of time here. Does anybody have any questions or comments they want to make? Before I give you the Audre Lorde reading questions for next time and let you go.
So did they, like, eventually agree with King
Oh, the clergyman in the letter?
Yes and no.
Yeah, yes and no would be they continued largely to offer relatively lukewarm support for civil rights legislation. And he does mention in the letter concrete steps that some of those individuals had taken towards desegregating different institutions in Birmingham, right? That Earl Stallings, the Baptist pastor, for example, did hold mixed race services. The Catholic clergy he mentions had desegregated a Catholic college in Birmingham called Spring Hill. So he gives them credit where he thinks it's due, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, by and large, these guys are mostly remembered for being on the wrong side of history, or well, for not really taking a side, I guess is more accurate. And I didn't. I left the. All right. Oh no, here it is. I just do not have my shit together. Really.